Hi, and welcome to our first lecture on the patterns of development. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so the first pattern of development that we'll be discussing is description. Now, with each of the different PowerPoints that we'll have throughout the semester, I'll have a little grammar blurb that starts them off and that will relate to the topics that we're learning, as well as help you to study for the final grammar exam. So the first thing is adjectives. They're used to describe nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. They usually come before the thing that they're modifying, whereas adverbs will be used to describe verbs and how the subject does the action. So an adjective would be green. I'm describing something about that item. If I'm describing how something does something, so if I'm saying he walks quickly, I'm describing how he walks. With the adverbs, they will usually end in ly, except for a few rare cases. But the adverbs will end in ly, so you wouldn't say he walked quick, he walked quickly. Pronoun case and antecedent, we have both subjective and objective, and they have to be matching in person and number. So what do I mean here? For a subjective pronoun, that means it is the subject of the sentence. So it will do the action of the sentence that we have. So I go to the store. We go to the store. You is pretty much normal depending on objective and subjective. He goes to the store. She goes to the store. Who goes to the store? I'll come back to that in a minute. It goes to the store. They go to the store. The objective pronoun is the one that receives the action in the sentence. So in a case of something of like, I gave the book or he gave the book, the person, he is doing the action, so we use that subjective pronoun. Who are we giving that book to? We can answer. He gave the book to me. I'm receiving the action of the book, so I need me. He gave the book to us. He gave the book to him. He gave the book to her. He gave the book to it. He gave the book to them. Now, who and whom you can use the same exact way. So who is a subjective and whom is it an objective? And the best way to remember it is that M on the end of him or them is the same as the end of whom. So if you could put him in that place, answering that question, you need whom. If you could put he in that place instead of who, then you need who. So if I had the doctor that was going to perform the surgery, I wouldn't use that. I would need to use who or whom. I would say he or she is going to perform the surgery, so I would say who performs the surgery. If I say he gave the book to whom, then it would be, since I could say he gave the book to him or gave the book to them, he gave the book to whom, or to whom did he give the book. So sometimes those will be switched around, that you have to just try to think about answering the question in order to think about who needs to actually be the subject or the object of the sentence. Now, possessive pronouns will never have an apostrophe with them. So my, mine, our, ours, our with an apostrophe is no such word. Your and yours are the possessive. Your, Y-O-U apostrophe R-E, is a contraction for you are. So the key thing is, if you're looking at a sentence and you're trying to decide if you need the contraction or the possessive, start by first breaking apart that contraction, because we're going to write out contractions in formal writing anyway. So if I can say you are here, then I need your, which in that case I need to write it out anyway, so I do you are here. If I do you are books, well, that doesn't make much sense. So I know it means your books, Y-O-U-R, is the one that I need. And in case of possession, it's wherever the object is belongs to the pronoun that you're trying to do. His, hers, whose, its, their, and theirs. So who apostrophe S is short for who is. Its, it apostrophe S is short for it is. Their, T-H-E-R-E, is directional, saying over there, or there are many books in this place. Their, T-H-Y-R-E, with the apostrophe, is short for there are. And theirs, T-H-E-R-E, apostrophe S, is short for there is. So they follow the same exact idea of if you can break them apart and they make sense, then you're actually looking at the contraction of which is the word you need. If you are looking and it doesn't make sense, then you need the possessive pronoun without the apostrophe. Okay. So the next thing is subject-verb agreement. So for each subject that we have and each verb that we have, they have to match in number. And so do our pronouns. So going back to pronouns for just a moment, if we're talking about something, the student gives his, her, their homework to the teacher. Student as a noun is singular. So it has to be in singular format, which one we use. So we can't say the student gives their homework to the teacher because there is plural. So we have to say gives his or hers. If we know the gender, we could just say gives his or gives her homework to the teacher. Or we could say a student gives one's, O-N-E apostrophe S, one's homework to the professor. The same way if we have students, we're going to do the students give their homework because we have plural. Where it gets tricky is more with corporations and collective nouns. So we think of a baseball team as having multiple players on it. So we think of it as being plural because there are many people. It's made up of multiple people. But it's not actually plural when you're talking about the team itself. The team itself is a single entity comprised of many things. So if we're talking about a baseball team or a company like McDonald's or Amazon or Walmart, we're saying an employee of Walmart, say, would be Walmart's employee, its employee, because it's singular. If we're talking about a plural type of one, it's still going to be. So Gaskins is a restaurant that ends in S. It's still going to be its employees because Gaskins is a singular entity company. When you start talking about the members of the team's members still have to be its members, singular. But if you're saying the members' jerseys, then in that case, it would be plural. So you have those with that. With subject-verb agreement, it's the same way. If you have a singular subject, you need a singular verb to go with it. So he says. If they have a plural subject, you need a plural verb to go with it. So they say. You need to have a, what's the word for it? You need to have it match in number each time. Where it gets tricky is when you have phrases that come in between the subject and the verb. So he, let's see, the shelf of books. We see that books right next to the verb, so we automatically want to say are because it's there. But we have instead, we have the sentence is shelf. So the shelf of books is. So sometimes we have to remove the parts out and think about what is the actual subject of the sentence, remove it from the phrasing that's around it, put the verb next to it, and then we can tell what it's supposed to be. Finally, we have fragments and independent and dependent clauses. So what that means is that an independent clause can stand by itself and make a complete sentence without you questioning, well, what more is there? So I can say I bought milk, cheese, and eggs, and I understand that who the person is, I understand the action, bought, and the objects, what was bought. Everything's pretty much clear in that sentence. I'm not left wondering other information, other details. If I have when I went to the store, I'm left wondering, well, what happened when you went to the store? Why did you go to the store? What other details can be used in order to make this sentence come out clearer for our audience? So that would be a dependent clause because it depends upon the independent clause in order to make a complete sentence. If we have that dependent clause by itself, that's where it's considered a fragment. So when I went to the store would be considered a fragment. If we put it with the independent clause, I bought milk, cheese, and eggs, then it's now a complete sentence with one dependent clause and one independent clause. Other cases that we get are when we try to add on to things. So if we're trying to say Purdue University has many different types of sports, for example, baseball, football, basketball, even though we have the sentence previous to it that says Purdue University has many types of sports, so we would understand that this is an example of the sports at Purdue University. If we take that sentence out and leave it by itself without that previous sentence as a way to clear up what's going on, it doesn't make sense. For example, baseball, football, basketball. We don't know what's going on here. We know it's talking about sports, but what is it talking about? What is it examples of? So we have to have that as either an example of this is, or examples are baseball, football, basketball. Now it's a complete sentence. Or we can combine it with the previous sentence with a comma and say, for example, baseball, football, basketball. Which was why he did it. Another one, anything that starts with which instead of this. If you're saying which is this, which is why this, which is what is this, that usually is going to be a fragment by itself. Even though it has a pronoun-ish word referring back to something you said previously, you still want to be more clear. It's better to say this and start a sentence with this than it is to start a sentence with which. While he went to the store. So things like as she went to the store, while he went to the store, those type of words of saying that someone is doing something while doing something else or at the same time as, those are going to be fragments if left by themselves. So if he had while he went to the store, he listened to music, that would be a complete sentence because we have the idea of during the time he's at the store, what was he doing? We also have a few other cases of fragments. So one of them is the participle phrase. So those are usually ending in ing or ed In the case of irregular verbs, it might be like burnt or spoken. That might begin the phrase. So this idea of worrying that a meteor or chunk of space debris will conk her on the head. If we leave it right at that, yes, we have the idea of that person's worrying, but what's going on? Aunt Olivia always wears a motorcycle helmet. Because is another one of those words that is just like that. That is a participle phrase in that it can be used to start a sentence if it is used correctly. If you think about it, we can do Aunt Olivia always wears a motorcycle helmet because she worries that a meteor or chunk of space debris will conk her on the head. That's how we've traditionally been taught to write our sentences. Because we want to make sure that we're not leaving it as a fragment. But if you start a sentence with because and you have that phrase with it, if you have that comma separating it from the main independent clause, you can start a sentence with because. You could also just change it into another sentence. Another one are infinitive phrases. So if you wanted to say, to explain why he had brought Squeeze, the 7-foot pet python, to Mr. Parker's English class, although we have a lot there, we have a subject, we have a verb, we have an object, we have an idea, but it's not complete because we still have to explain what, why, what is he doing, what's going on. So we need the rest of the sentence to be put with it, either by putting that infinitive in the middle of the sentence. So jiggling his foot nervously, Ronald sat in the provost's office to explain. Or we can add that comma and say Ronald sat in the provost's office jiggling his foot nervously. Now we have given our idea. Like I said, those afterthought fragments can really cause it. Lonely verbs. A lot of times if we have and, let the raccoons, possums, and armadillos that visit the yard eat the leftovers. In this case, it's by itself. Yes, there's a subject. Yes, there's a verb. Yes, there's an idea, but it's not complete without that first sentence. So it's better to connect them together and say, after dinner, Mike and Pat leave their dirty dishes on the back patio and let the raccoons, possums, and armadillos that visit the yard eat the leftovers. One other case is in a positive phrase. So a red convertible with fancy rims and fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror. We have an idea of a description, but we have to have that description connected to a main clause to make it a complete sentence. So those are the cases where you want to have that complete sentence and to try to break it apart so you don't have fragments. More often with these grammar problems, it's easier to catch them on the back end after you've already written them and as you're reviewing them, you're going through the editing process, than it is to do it from the first point of view. Okay, so first thing with description is we have to use sensory details. So details like smell, sight, sound, taste, and touch, wherever we can. Obviously, there's going to be some instances where you can't have one of those senses or it's not going to apply to the situation. But there are other senses that we can bring in as well. So the sense of that feeling you get of that instinct, feeling of instinct, or a mother's intuition, or a gut feeling, or there are many different sensations that we can have where we just know something. So those kind of sensations are still senses that we need to, or sensations that we can put as part of our description as long as it helps us to properly describe the situation that we're trying to do. If it doesn't contribute to what we're describing, there's no point in having it in our paragraph or paper. So for example, if you've lived in the North or you've lived in the South, either of these would make sense to you. Now, I can say it smells like orange blossoms, and someone from the South will know exactly what I'm talking about because they're like, duh, I've smelled orange blossoms, I know what they smell like. Or if I said the crinkling of leaves that have dried out, or the smell of leaves after a rain. In that case, someone who's been up north, even someone from the South, because leaves still fall in the South, but more likely someone from the North where the leaves change and fall en masse in the summer of the autumn, is going to understand that particular sensation. But you have to think about who your audience is. So if you know you're writing to a Southern audience, then saying it smells like orange blossoms, you're done. You've got your sense of smell, you're good. You've described it. But if you're writing for a much broader audience, or say you're writing for children who may not have as many experiences, or you're writing for someone who has their senses, one of their senses is off. Maybe they can't hear, or they can't see, or they can't, well, I'm sure there are people who can't taste as well, but mostly hear and see. Even sometimes when our nose is stuffed up and we can't smell, you want to describe those different senses that you're having in a little bit more of a detailed way. So, for example, in one of the articles you read for this week, it was about a blind boy who was fishing. And if you notice, a lot of the descriptions, because Cherokee Paul McDonald is trying to think about how to describe it to someone who can't see, he's trying to do it using the other senses. So if I was trying to describe to someone who can't smell what orange blossoms smell like my dad who gets allergic to them every time they bloom, I can tell him it smells like citrus, like it smells like a burning orange peel mixed with flowers. To someone who can't hear, I could say that the leaves crinkle like the feeling of paper crinkling together as you roll it into a ball. For someone who can't see, I could say that the color, I maybe can't really describe the color as much about it being orange, but I can say that there are warm colors like the warmth from light would be. So you can describe these different situations in many different ways. You just have to think about who your audience is and how you're going to describe them. So that's part of our pre-writing. Is the first thing we need to do is figure out who our audience is going to be. And then we have to figure out what our purpose is going to be. If our purpose is to describe something to recommend it, we're probably going to want to use more positive language if we're saying that we really liked it. If we're trying to give an honest review of something, we might use mixed language. If we're trying to tell people, stay away from that, it's horrible, you'll never like it, then you're going to want to use more negative connotation language. So based on our purpose, we'll determine what types of descriptions we use, because there are many, 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 many descriptions that you can give of a situation based on just the senses alone. You also want to determine, is it going to be objective? Are you just reporting what the sense, smell, the sounds, the sights, are you just reporting what the senses are? Or are you giving your opinion on what those sights and smells are? Are you telling us that the smells of Grandma's kitchen smell good? That is subjective because you're telling us that they smell good to you. Whereas you can just say they smell like cookies, and we've given a basic description of the sense that's being experienced. We also want to determine that dominant impressions. That's based on our purpose. So what picture of this place or thing do you want to provide? So for example, when you did your diagnostic essays, I had you describe your favorite animal. So that dominant impression that I got from that essay would be that it's your favorite animal based on the things that you describe about it. If you describe a lot of negative things about it, I wouldn't think that's your favorite animal. If you describe a lot of positive things about it, I would think it's your favorite animal for sure. The same way, if I'm describing a space, like, say, Main Street, USA in the Magic Kingdom, if I want to say it's the happiest place on earth, I'm going to use all of the senses that really show what it is as the happiest place on earth. That there are children laughing, there are balloons in the sky, there's music playing, there's the smell of hot dogs and french fries and popcorn and ice cream, there's the taste of that popcorn in the air, there's the feeling of people around you, that perception of people around you more so than reaching out and touching them. There could be touches that you sense in that situation. But if I'm trying to say that the Magic Kingdom is not the happiest place on earth, that it is more for little kids and not really my style, then in that case, I'm not going to want to say about hearing children laughing. Maybe I hear the children screaming. Maybe I smell too many smells all at once. Or maybe I smell burnt popcorn. Maybe I can taste something in the air, whether that be that burnt popcorn, or smell the sweat of people around you. Touch, maybe I feel crowded and claustrophobic because there are too many people around me, or I'm getting bumped into because it's too crowded. Maybe I'm seeing lots of strollers everywhere to trip over. There are different types of descriptions that I'm going to give depending on what my dominant impression is. So once you know what your dominant impression is, then you can determine, out of all of the possible sensory details that you could add, which ones fit the dominant impression that you're trying to bring across in your writing. And then we want to determine the order that we give those sensory details in. So if it's spatially, so I could say, as you walk down Main Street, USA, and reach the main square, and I can do everything as I'm walking down Main Street, USA. I can do everything that I sense while in the square. I can do everything in Fantasyland. I can do everything. So it's spatially, it's by the space that I'm in. I can also do it chronologically, so based on the time period. So first, I hear the sounds of children screaming and laughing. Then I smell the food as I work further down Main Street, USA. Now I can see the castle and the balloons flying everywhere. Sensory could be by sensory detail, so I could do all of the sights about Magic Kingdom in one paragraph, all of the smells in another, all of the sounds in another, and maybe a fourth body paragraph that says about the little bits of taste and touch that I would sense at Magic Kingdom. There's also the idea of the emphatic. So emphatic means that you're leaving the best for last. So you start with your second best sensory detail, your second best point, so that way you can draw your reader into the rest of the essay from your thesis. Then you use your weakest point as your middle body paragraph, or paragraphs, depending on how many paragraphs you have. And that way you have gained people's attention. They're going to continue reading because they want to read what's next, but you get through the weaker point. And then you end on the point that you want them to, your audience, to remember the most from your writing. So that's going to be your best point, leaving that best for last. So that way your audience will continue to think about that point as they continue on to your conclusion. So when you're drafting, there's a big idea between showing and not telling. So you can tell some things. You can say the air smelled of popcorn, or the castle was blue and white, or the children's scream was piercing. Or you can show us as it happens, so that way we're not just being told this is what it is and what the sounds are and what it is. You can say piercing screams filled the air. Now you've showed me that same idea, that the children's screams were piercing, but you showed it to me rather than told me I can hear the sound. The same way you can say the blue and white castle rose above the town square and towered over Magic Kingdom's Main Street, USA. I don't have to say the castle was blue and white. I can use these ways to show and basically tell a story with those descriptions. We also want to think about what messages we're giving. So again, based on that dominant impression, are we giving certain messages? So for example, Cherokee Paul McDonald in his essay, his main message that he tries to portray is don't judge a book by its cover, and really to stop and appreciate what you sense. Don't let time force you to keep moving on. So he has these messages that he tries to portray in addition to his dominant impression of he was being kind of a jerk, and then he learned his lesson and learned to appreciate things that he saw in a different way. We also can use figurative language in order to help us describe. So instead of just sensory information. So we might use something like a metaphor or a simile. And the difference is a metaphor will use, it's describing two things, how they're alike, without using the word like or as. A simile uses the word like or as. So if I said my love is like a red, red rose, I'm describing love and red, red rose as two things that are similar to each other, and I'm using the word like. If I say, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And in this case, I'm saying that the person that I'm talking to and a summer's day are similar to each other, but I'm bringing them together through a sentence instead of using like or as. I can also use imagery. So that idea of saying, well, it smells like a citrus or an orange peel that's been lit up in a mixture of flowers. If I'm using things like Paul McDonald says, that he says scales like interlocking together so that the child could see how those scales fit upon each other, that they glittered like glitter does, or something like that. So different types of imagery to help us do it. And it's not just for those who can't see or can't hear or can't smell or etc. It's, you want to mix up so that you're giving sensory detail plus some imagery and metaphors and similes. You give a little bit of everything so that your writing isn't just one basic style. And then we also have personification. So personification is when we take a non-human object, even technically animals, and give them human traits. So if I say the sloth smiled, well, we don't really know that that sloth is smiling, but it's the closest I can come to explaining what it looks like to me. So the sloth smiled, or the leaves danced in the breeze. Sounds a lot better than just normal leaves rustled in the wind. You can still use rustled in the wind, but for someone like a child who may not understand rustled, you can say they danced in the breeze, and the child will understand because they've danced before. So you can understand those different words. You can mix up those different types of sensory details that you give in your writing to make it more interesting. When we're revising and editing, so the first step is revising. In that case, you want to look at your language and your dominant impression. So does your dominant impression match the language that you use? Does your dominant impression come across clearly? Does your purpose of writing come across clearly? Or at least if your purpose isn't to be communicated to the audience, can you at least show that you completed what you were supposed to complete? So that if you were to do a review of a place and you're giving descriptions of it, like say a description of Paris, if you think it's the most wonderful place on earth, did you complete your purpose of telling people that it's the most wonderful place on earth, or do you need to do more work with it? Do you use imagery like those metaphors, those similes, personification, etc., as well as sensory detail? Do you mix it up? Do you allow yourself to use different types at different times to make your writing more interesting and more varied? Then when you go into the editing process, that's when you're focusing on the tinier details. So you're focusing on, is my grammar correct? Are my adjectives versus adverbs correct? Are my subject and verbs agreeing with each other? Are my pronouns correct? Are my punctuations correct? Do I have the right spelling of the word that I'm thinking of? That way you can really get in there and get the nitty-gritty details after you've made sure the writing is the way you want it to be. And like I said earlier in the presentation, a lot of these grammar problems are easier to catch after you've already written them than it is to catch them as you're writing. So just worry about writing your ideas down, getting that information down, and then put forth the effort to try to edit and make it sound better and make it better grammatically. So in that discussion, the essays, you discuss them in the discussion board this week, but I also want to just have you think about, what is the dominant impression of the storm this time? What is the analogy that Helvarg uses? So for those who may not have caught it, Helvarg describes the chaos and the destruction as like being in part of a war zone. And for many people, they've never been to war. So it's showing that it's that severe, that bad. It's not just the destruction after a normal storm. It's really severe, really bad. The same way that he could have described it as the way people felt after 9/11. You know, a lot of us were younger when that happened and may not remember, but for those who do, for example, I was in Washington, D.C. So for me, it was like being in a war zone, even though I was not anywhere near the Pentagon. I was far enough away from it, but I could see the destruction of the Pentagon. I saw it get hit. I saw the destruction in the flames. I was at the medical hospital, so I saw the soldiers bringing in the wounded. I saw how eerie and quiet it was because everybody was afraid of where is it going to hit next. So those type of things, to describe it, I can give those descriptions of that it's eerie, that it was like a war zone, so that way people can understand what it was like where I was at during that time period. And Helvarg is doing the same thing. Thinking about what other sensory details does he use other than sight? What are your perceptions of the story and what's going on? The same thing with MacDonald. What is his dominant impression? What kind of imagery does he use? Thinking about especially how he describes sight without sight words. So that way the child can really truly understand what he's saying. And again, the perceptions of the story. So if you have any questions, please email me or text me and let me know. And I will be happy to go over with you. I'll also have my office hours Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Monday from 12 to 1, I'll be in the writing studio conferences. And then from 1 to 2, I'll be in conferences in our class. I can also do Zoom, so whatever is needed for the time. All right, so that is it for this week. Enjoy writing about your favorite place, and I can't wait to see what y'all come up with. Thanks, and have a great day.